My name is Serena Hall, and I was 34 the night my father read one page and sat down without being asked. 2 weeks earlier, my parents had announced they were selling my grandmother's house with her still living in it. They said it the way you'd read a grocery list, and that calm was the cruelest part. But the folder my grandmother handed across the table that night wasn't the end of anything. It was the part they couldn't undo. So they tried to undo my grandmother instead. They had a plan for the house. They did not have a plan for her. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we sit with the quiet people who kept the receipts and watch what happens when an entitled family finally meets the paperwork. If a story ever made you pick up the phone and check on someone you love, you already belong here. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. My grandfather built that house in 1961 board by board on a half-acre at the end of Wexler Road. Earl Holt poured the porch himself. He set the door frames a quarter-inch out of true and never fixed them because my grandmother said a house should have a little crookedness, same as people. After he died 6 years ago, Opel stayed. She was 83 then, and everybody waited for her to fall apart. She didn't. She kept the garden, kept the porch light burning every single night, and kept her tea. That was the thing you learned first about my grandmother. Every afternoon at 4, she set out 2 cups. Even when she was alone, even when nobody came, the spoon against the china made a small, clean sound, like a tiny bell ringing a meeting to order. I came by every week. I lived 15 minutes away across town in a 1-bedroom over the hardware store. And I'd drive over after work and we'd sit on the porch and not say much. She'd pour. The light would be on before I ever reached the steps. Warm and yellow, like she'd lit it for me before I knew I was coming. I used to think that light meant nothing here would ever change. I was a paralegal at a little firm 2 streets off the square. The kind of office that did wills and deeds and the slow, careful work of helping old people decide where things go. I spent my days reading other families' arrangements. I never once imagined I'd need to read my own. It came out at Sunday dinner at my parents' house on the other side of town. My mother served pot roast and waited until the plates were full, which I later understood was strategy. She set down the gravy and said it plainly. "We're putting your grandmother's house on the market. It's time." My father nodded at his plate. My brother Derek kept eating. I set my fork down. "On the market," I said, "while she's living in it." My mother folded her napkin into a perfect square. "She can't manage out there anymore. Serena, the yard, the stairs, all of it. We found a place, Maple Crest, the memory care wing. They have an opening." I said Gran climbed those stairs every day and managed fine. My mother gave me the look she saves for when I'm being difficult. "It's just logistics, honey." She said the memory care place takes her Medicaid. She said it like that settled everything, like my grandmother was a line item and the line had finally been reconciled. The pot roast went cold in front of me. I looked at my father, who used to lift me onto that crooked porch when I was small, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at Derek, who shrugged like the whole thing was weather. "Has anyone," I said very evenly, "actually asked her?" The silence that came back told me everything. They hadn't asked Opel. They weren't going to. They'd already toured the facility, already called somebody about the house, already divided up a future that wasn't theirs to divide. I drove the long way home that night, past Wexler Road, and the porch light was on. It looked for the first time like something that needed protecting. I should tell you what I am in this family so you understand why nobody worried about me getting in the way. I'm the one who handles things. When Derek totaled his first car, I found the lawyer. When my parents' furnace died on Christmas Eve, I called the repair line and paid the deposit. When Earl was dying, I sat the night shifts at the hospital because somebody had to and everybody else had reasons. I don't say that to sound noble. It's closer to a flaw than a virtue. I take on what isn't mine until I forget the difference. And I'd gotten so used to carrying things that the family had stopped noticing the weight. They thought of me as reliable, which is another word for furniture. So when they planned to sell Opal's house, it never crossed their minds that the reliable one might plant her feet. They figured I'd grumble and then organize the move, label the cabinets, drive the boxes. They had the wrong idea about me, and I let them keep it because the wrong idea is sometimes the most useful thing a quiet person owns. I didn't raise my voice at that dinner. I didn't cry. I went home and I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I'd made the way Gran taught me. And I thought about what I actually knew. I knew my parents were in a hurry. I knew people in a hurry skip steps. And I knew from 8 years of reading deeds for a living that you cannot sell a house you don't fully own. That last thought sat down beside me and didn't leave. My father wasn't cruel. He was drowning, which can look the same from the outside. Roy Hall had run a landscaping and grading outfit for 30 years and 2 bad seasons, and one defaulted contract had hollowed it out. He'd refinanced his own house to cover payroll, then refinanced again to cover the first refinance. I learned the numbers later, but I could read the shape of it that spring just from how he held his shoulders. He'd started calling the sale the responsible thing. He said it to me on the phone a few days after the dinner, his voice careful and rehearsed. "Mom's house is just sitting there, Serena. It's $400,000 of equity doing nothing. We could solve a lot of problems. Well, he said like the equity already had our name on it. I asked him whose problems. He didn't answer that. He told me Mapler was a good place, clean, that they did crafts and had a garden, and I believed the place was fine. That wasn't the question. The question was whether a frightened man gets to decide that his mother's home is a resource to be liquidated because his own house was sinking. I felt for him. I want to be honest about that. I have felt the cold math of money panic, the way it makes decent people reach for things that aren't theirs and call it sense, but feeling for him didn't change the deed. And somewhere underneath the fear, my father had made a choice. He decided to be sorry later, if at all, and rich sooner. So I stopped arguing with him on the phone. Arguing was a tool that didn't fit this job. Derek fell in line the way water finds the low spot. My brother is 30 and he was behind on a truck loan and 3 months late on child support for his son. And somewhere in the planning, he'd been promised a piece. He didn't say it to me outright. He said things around it. Once the house sells, things will loosen up. Dad's going to take care of everybody. He'd convinced himself it was fair, that he was owed, though nobody could have told you for what. That's the part that still turns my stomach a little. Not that he was greedy, but that the greed wore the costume of decency. A family taking care of family, while the actual family member at the center of it poured tea alone on Wexler Road and had no idea her grandchildren were dividing the roof over her head. I found out at a barbecue that the three of them had already met with a realtor named Cindy from a brokerage out by the highway. Met with her, walked the property, talked square footage and comps and a quick close while Opel was at her hair appointment so she wouldn't see the car in the drive. They'd timed it around her schedule. That's when I stopped thinking of this as a disagreement and started thinking of it as a thing being done to someone, to my grandmother, behind a locked door of her own life. I didn't tell Derek what I knew. I didn't tell any of them. I went home and I opened my laptop and I typed in an address I'd known by heart since I was 7 years old. But before any of that, I drove out to tell Opel. I thought I'd be breaking the news. I had the whole gentle speech ready, the one you give before you hand someone a grief. She was on the porch when I pulled up. Light already on, the kettle already singing through the screen door. I sat down. I told her as softly as I could that Mom and Dad wanted to sell the house and move her to Maple Crest. I watched her face for the crack I was dreading. It didn't come. She reached for the pot and poured slow and even. And the spoon touched the china with that small clean sound. I know, honey, she said just that, and the bottom dropped out of my whole careful speech. I asked how she knew. She smiled, not bitterly, more like a woman who'd seen the weather coming for a while. Cindy left her card in the door, she said, and your mother's been measuring my rooms when she thinks I'm napping. I'm 89, I'm not asleep. I started to tell her we'd fight it, that I'd find a way, and she put her hand over mine. Her hand was cool and dry and absolutely steady. Come by Tuesday was all she said, just you have your tea first. Then she changed the subject to the tomatoes. I drove home unsettled in a way I couldn't name. I'd come to comfort a frightened old woman and found instead somebody calmer than I was. People don't get calm like that from being helpless. They get it from being ready. I just didn't know yet what she was ready for. The clock started that same week. My parents weren't waiting for anybody's blessing. Cindy, the realtor, scheduled a formal walkthrough and a comp appraisal for the following Monday. My mother booked the Maple Crest tour for the family and put my name on it without asking, the way she'd been putting my name on her plans my whole life. I got the calendar invite at work and stared at it between drafting 2 trust amendments for clients I'd never met, families who'd done the careful thing years early so nobody would have to fight in a hurry. The irony sat on my desk like a paper weight. My parents had set their plan moving at speed, and speed was their whole advantage. A hurried family steamrolls a careful one because care takes time and steamrollers don't. I knew that. I'd watched it happen to strangers across a conference table. I just never thought I'd be the careful one standing in the road. That weekend, a small white sign went up at the end of the drive on Wexler Road. Coming soon, it said, with Cindy's smiling photo and a phone number. I happened to be there when the sign man pounded it in, because I'd started coming by more, watching the house the way you watch a stove you don't trust. Opel came to the front window with her cup in her hand. She looked at the sign and then she looked at me, and she did the last thing I expected. She smiled. Not a sad smile, a patient one, the kind you give a card player who's just bet everything on a hand he hasn't seen. Then she lifted her cup an inch like a toast and went back inside to her tea. I tried the reasonable route first because I'm a person who tries the reasonable route first, even when I already suspect it's a dead end. I called my mother and asked plainly whether they'd talked to an elder law attorney before listing the house, whether they understood how Medicaid look-back worked, how the sale could actually cost more than it cleared. I used my work voice, calm and specific, the voice I used to keep clients from doing something they'll grieve. My mother heard concern as obstruction. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Serena, she said. Everything's handled. Your father's been thorough. Thorough? My father who refinanced a refinance. I asked who held my grandmother's power of attorney, and there was a pause on the line, the kind that tells you you've touched the thing they hoped you wouldn't ask about. Your father does, she said, for her finances, so this is all perfectly legal before you start. Then she hung up, not angry, just done. the way you end a call with a telemarketer. I sat there with the dead phone and felt the reasonable route close behind me. They weren't going to slow down. They weren't going to ask Opel. They had a power of attorney and a realtor and a deadline. And they were sure that was enough because they'd never had reason to learn that it might not be. So I did the thing I do when talking stops working. I did what I do at work. I stopped asking people what was true and went and looked it up myself. I opened my laptop that night, logged into the county recorder portal the same way I did a dozen times a day for clients, and I pulled the record on the house at the end of Wexler Road. The record loaded slow, the way old county scans do. I knew this property's history in my bones, or thought I did. Earl and Opel halt joint since 1961. What I expected was a clean chain ending with Opel as sole owner after Earl passed. What I got stopped me cold. There was a more recent instrument on the file recorded about 6 years back, the spring after the funeral. The index line called it a deed with a reservation of a life estate. The scan itself was partial on the public portal. The second page cut off the way these old uploads sometimes are, but the index summary listed 2 names in the grantee field. One was Opel's, the other was cut off at the margin, just a first initial and the start of a surname I couldn't quite read. I sat very still, a reservation of life estate. I drafted those at work. I knew exactly what it meant in shape even before I could read the names. It meant that at some point quietly the ownership of that house had been rearranged. It meant Opel had kept the right to live there for the rest of her life. That was the life estate, hers to hold until her last day. And it meant the remainder, the ownership that takes over after, had been deeded to somebody else. Somebody whose name started with a letter I couldn't see. My father held a financial power of attorney, but a power of attorney lets you act for what a person owns. It doesn't conjure ownership that was given away years before you ever got the paperwork. I closed the laptop and just breathed for a minute. Then I opened it again to make sure I'd read it right. I had whatever was on that deed. My parents either didn't know or didn't believe it mattered because the pressure on Opel only got worse. They came on a Saturday to start getting organized, which meant my mother wrapping the good plates in newspaper and my father pacing the rooms with a tape measure he didn't need. They spoke about Opel in front of Opel as if she'd already left. We'll donate most of this. The bedroom set might be worth something. She won't need all these dishes at Mapler. My grandmother sat in her chair by the window through all of it, hands folded, watching them sort her 60 years like a yard sale. I came by mid-morning and found Cindy, the realtor, in the kitchen taking listing photos, angling her phone to make the small rooms look big. And here is the thing I will never forget. Opel got up, went to the stove, and put the kettle on. She made tea for Cindy, for the woman photographing her home for strangers. She poured a cup and set it down by the sink with that small, clean clink of spoon on china, and she said, "You'll work better with something warm in you, dear." Cindy didn't know what to do with that. None of them did. My mother frowned like the courtesy was a kind of trick. And maybe it was because watching my grandmother pour tea for the people dismantling her life, perfectly calm, perfectly polite, I finally understood that her calm wasn't surrender. It was a held breath. It was a woman standing in the eye of a storm she had personally arranged, waiting for the wind to turn. I just had to wait with her and trust that she knew the date the wind was coming. That afternoon after they'd gone, Opel and I had our real tea, the 4 o'clock kind, just us on the porch with the light on, though it was still day. She told me about Earl and the house. I'd heard pieces over the years, but she told it whole that day, like she wanted it on the record in me. How they'd bought the half-acre for almost nothing in '61. How Earl had built it slow because they could only afford materials a paycheck at a time. How a man from the bank had once tried to talk Earl into a second mortgage to fund some scheme, and Earl had walked him to the door. "Your grandfather had one rule about this house," she said, looking out at the yard he'd graded by hand. "He used to say a house should outlast the people who try to take it." She said it lightly, but she was watching me when she said it to see if it landed. It landed. I asked her, careful, whether she and Earl had ever changed anything about how the house was owned after he got sick, whether they'd done any planning. She poured another cup and didn't quite answer. "We did what we thought was right," she said when we still had our wits and nobody was rushing us. Then her eyes went just for a second toward the back of the house, toward the little room off the hall where she kept her sewing machine and her threads and a low cabinet. I'd never once thought about. She held the look a beat too long, then turned back to me and asked if I wanted the last of the lemon cake. I said yes, but I'd seen where she looked. I filed it away with the cut-off name on the deed, and the patient smile at the window, 3 pieces of a picture I couldn't yet see whole. The next week, Opel asked me to drive her to her regular checkup with Dr. Helen Voss, the geriatrician over in the medical park. It was on the calendar already. She just wanted company, she said, and didn't want her son driving. In the waiting room, she did the crossword in pen. When Dr. Voss called her back, Opel asked me to come too, which surprised me, and then asked the doctor to run the memory test, the long one. Dr. Voss raised an eyebrow but agreed. I watched my 89-year-old grandmother take a full cognitive screening, the kind they use to chart capacity and answer every question clean. The date, the season, the county, the president, counting backward from 100 by sevens without a stumble, drawing the clock with every number in its place and the hand set exactly where they asked, recalling all the words at the end that most people her age lose 2 or 3 of. Dr. Voss made notes and said mildly that she wished half her patients of any age tested that sharp. Opel thanked her and then said something that I didn't understand until much later. I'd like that written up properly. Doctor dated, and I'd like Serena to have a copy for my file. Dr. Voss looked between us since there was a current under the request she didn't need to know about and said, of course. On the drive back, I asked Opel why she wanted the cognitive note on paper. She looked out the window at the passing town. Because someday, she said, somebody is going to find it convenient to say I didn't know my own mind. And when they do, I'd rather not have to argue. I'd rather just hand them the answer. I should have understood it all right then. I almost did. But I was still thinking like a granddaughter, not like the paralegal she'd raised me to be. When we got back to the house, Opel didn't go to her chair. She walked me down the hall to the little sewing room, the one I'd glanced past 1,000 times. The afternoon light came in slantwise across her thread spools and the old machine. She knelt, slower than she used to, but steady, and pulled a small brass key out from under the felt lining of her sewing basket where it had clearly lived for years. She pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers over it. The metal was warm from sitting in the sun. This opens the cabinet under the window, she said. Don't open it today, you'll know when, but you keep this on you from now on, you hear me, not in a drawer at your place. On your key ring with the rest. I asked her what was in the cabinet. She smiled and patted my hand. What's mine to give, she said, and what's already given. There's a difference and someday it'll matter that you know it. Then she folded the doctor's appointment summary into thirds, the one Dr. Voss's office had printed, and tucked the copy into my bag herself, her thin fingers very deliberate. So I left Wexler Road that evening carrying 2 things I didn't fully understand. A signed, dated cognitive screening proving my grandmother was sharp as a tack on that exact day in spring, and a small brass key to a cabinet I'd been told not to open. I put the key on my ring at a red light before I even got home because she'd told me to, and because some part of me had started to trust that this woman knew precisely what she was doing. That key rode in my pocket for the next 3 weeks while everything got worse. I'd touch it sometimes without meaning to, a small warm weight like a held breath of my own. I just didn't know yet what it was holding. My mother found out I'd taken Opel to the doctor and she treated it like a betrayal. She called me that night and her voice had a new edge, the edge of someone whose plan had hit a pebble. Why are you running her to appointments behind our backs? I said it wasn't behind anyone's back, that Gran asked me that she has every right to see her own doctor. She doesn't know what she needs anymore. Serena, that's the whole point. She doesn't even know what she's signing half the time. I held very still when she said that because it told me where they were heading. She doesn't know what she's signing. They were already building the story they'd need if anything about the ownership of that house didn't go their way. If Opel turned out to have signed something, well, she's confused, isn't she? She doesn't know her own mind. Somebody must have taken advantage. I kept my voice level. I'd been practicing level. I told my mother that Gran had just tested perfectly sharp at the doctor, that there was a signed report saying so. The silence on the line went cold and thoughtful. I'd meant it as reassurance. I realized now I'd shown her a card too early. Well, my mother said finally, recalculating. Old people can be sharp one day and gone the next. Doctors don't see what we see. Then softer, almost kind, which was worse. You're too close to her, honey. It's clouding your judgment. She hung up and I sat with the brass key in my hand, turning it over, and understood that this was no longer just about a house. They had started very quietly to question whether my grandmother was a whole person with the right to decide. And I knew the way you know a storm by the smell that they wouldn't stop there. The coming soon sign came down and a for real sign went up in its place. And the difference between those 2 signs is the difference between a threat and an act. It went live on the listing sites the same morning. Photos of my grandmother's kitchen, her bedroom, the porch Earl built, all staged and bright and captioned with words like charming and great bones and motivated seller. Motivated. I drove past on my lunch break and there it was, planted in Earl's grass, Cindy's smiling face turned toward the road. 2 neighbors stood at the property line, and I knew without hearing that they were asking each other the question the whole street was asking. Is Opel all right? Did something happen to Opel? My grandmother had lived on that road for 60 years and now her home was a sale and she was the subject of sidewalk worry. That's its own kind of cruelty. The public kind, the kind that makes people whisper your loved one into something pitiable. I called my mother not to argue, just to confirm what I was seeing. She answered distracted, half in a meeting somewhere. It's just logistics, Serena, she said. The phrase again worn smooth from use. The memory care place takes her Medicaid. This is the responsible thing, logistics. I looked at the porch light, which was on even in the daylight, even now burning steady over a for real sign like it refused to acknowledge the thing planted beneath it. And something in me that had been waiting, polite and patient like my grandmother, quietly set its feet. I wasn't going to label cabinets and drive boxes. I was going to find out what was in that sewing room, and I was going to be ready when she told me it was time. I work for elder law attorneys, so the next morning I did at my desk what I'd been afraid to do at home. I read everything we had on life estates. I told myself it was for a client. It wasn't. Here is what a reservation of a life estate means. In plain words, the way I'd explain it to one of our families across the table. When you deed your home but reserve a life estate, you give the ownership away now, but you keep the absolute right to live there for the rest of your life. The person you deed it to is called the remainder man. They own what comes after. And the part that mattered most for Wexler Road, the part I read 3 times to be sure. Under Ohio law, a life tenant generally cannot be forced out. And the property usually cannot be sold during her lifetime unless both the life tenant and the remainder man agree and sign both of them. If Opel had reserved a life estate 6 years ago and deed the remainder to someone, then my parents' power of attorney was a key to a door that no longer existed. They couldn't sell that house out from under her. Not legally, not without the signature of whoever's name was cut off at the margin of that scan. I sat back in my chair and the whole shape of it finally turned toward me. My grandmother hadn't been waiting helplessly for rescue. She had quietly, years ago, with her wits about her and nobody rushing, built a wall around her home that my parents had walked straight into without seeing. And everything I needed to prove it was sitting behind a small brass lock my grandmother had already handed me in a cabinet she'd told me not to open until she said so. I touched the key in my pocket. Soon, I thought she'll tell me soon. If you've ever been the one in the family who reads the fine print while everybody else is busy spending what isn't theirs yet, you already know how lonely that quiet can get. You see the cliff coming and nobody wants the map. Stay with me because what my grandmother had been holding behind that lock changed every conversation that came after it. Subscribe so the next one finds you. The call came on a Tuesday the way she'd promised weeks before. Come for tea, Opel said, 4 o'clock, and Serena, bring your key. She'd never said bring your key before. My pulse picked up. But it wasn't only me she'd invited. I discovered when I pulled into the drive and saw my parents' car already there and Derek's truck behind it. My mother had told Opel she was coming by with some paperwork for her to sign, a listing. Disclosure and expanded power of attorney, the documents that would smooth the sale and tie up the last loose ends. Opel had said sweetly that they should all come at 4 and have some tea and bring the papers. So they'd taken it as a victory. They thought she was finally cooperating. They walked in expecting an old woman ready to sign her name where she was told. The porch light was on. The kettle was already singing. My grandmother sat at the head of her own table with 2 pots of tea steeping and her good cups out. The whole service like she was hosting something. She'd set a place for everyone, even me, even the people who'd come to take her home. I stood in the doorway with a brass key in my pocket and watched her pour the first cup. Slow and even, the spoon ringing once against the china, calling the meeting to order. My father had the papers in a manila envelope, and he set them by Opel's saucer like a man laying down a winning hand he was slightly ashamed of. Mom, we just need a few signatures, he said. It makes everything easier, the listing and a little update to the power of attorney so we can handle the closing without dragging you to an office. My mother slid a pen across the table. Right here, Opel, and here. We've marked them. They were gentle about it, which was the obscene part. Gentle the way you are with someone you've decided doesn't fully count. Derek wouldn't look at anyone. He stared into his teacup like it might have an exit in it. I started to stand, started to say, wait, because I couldn't watch them walk her into signing away the last of her standing. But Opel lifted one finger off the table just slightly and tipped her chin at me. The smallest motion, it said clear as speech. Sit down, honey, and let me. So I sat. I trusted her. She picked up the pen my mother had given her. She turned it over in her fingers, examining it like an unfamiliar object, and the whole table leaned in, certain she was about to sign. Then she set the pen down beside the cup very precisely and folded her hands. Before I sign anything, she said in the mild voice she used for the tomatoes and the weather. Serena, would you go to my sewing room and bring me the blue folder? It's in the cabinet under the window. The table went still. My mother's smile faltered at the edges, and I felt the brass key in my pocket go from a small, warm weight to the heaviest thing I had ever carried. I walked down the hall to the sewing room with everyone's eyes on my back. My hands weren't quite steady when I knelt at the cabinet under the window and fit the brass key into the lock. It turned easy, oiled like it had been waiting. Inside, on top of folded quilt batting, sat a single blue folder, its cover soft and furred at the corners from years of handling, a thick rubber band stretched around it to hold it closed. It had weight to it. I carried it back to the table with both hands and set it in front of my grandmother. She slid the rubber band off, opened it, and lifted out the first document. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't make a speech. She simply held it across the table to my father. You'll want to read this one first, Roy, she said. My father took it the way you take something you already suspect will bite. I watched his eyes go to the top of the page, to the heading, and I watched the color leave his face from the forehead down. It was a deed recorded stamped by the county recorder with a date 6 years gone the spring after Earl's funeral. I could see enough of it from where I stood to read the words that mattered, the words I'd been chasing through a cut-off scan for weeks. Reservation of a life estate, grantor, Opel Halt. And in the grantee line in the remainder, the name that had been hidden at the margin, Serena Holt me. My father read it once, then he read it again, his lips moving slightly, and then my father, who had come to his mother's house to get her to sign away her home, pulled out a chair and sat down. Nobody had asked him to, his knees just stopped holding him. He looked up at me across the table with an expression I'd never seen on him, like I'd done something to him. I hadn't done anything. She had 6 years ago. While they weren't watching for a moment, nobody spoke. Then my mother snatched the deed out of my father's hands and read it herself fast, her eyes jumping down the page. "This isn't real," she said, but her voice had a crack in it that said she already knew it was. Opel sipped her tea. "It's recorded down at the courthouse. Lynn has been for 6 years. Anyone can pull it. Serena could have told you that weeks ago if you'd let her finish a sentence." Then she set her cup down and explained it to the table the way you'd explain it to children, kindly and without mercy. Earl had been gone a season. She'd known even then how money makes people forget themselves. So she'd gone to a lawyer, Howard Pewitt, 2 towns over, and she deeded the house but kept a life estate. The house was hers to live in until her last day. That part the law protected. The ownership after her was already given. Given to me. "I made Serena the remainder," she said, "because she's the only one who ever came out here just to sit, not to measure the rooms." She looked at my father. "You can't sell what isn't yours, Roy. You never could. There was never a day in the last 6 years that you could." The pen still sat by her saucer untouched. And then she said the thing that I think about more than any other, mild as milk, looking right at her son. "I signed it the spring after Earl died," she said. "I just never told you." Derek made a sound like the air going out of something. My mother's face had gone from white to a mottled red, and my father just sat in the chair. His own legs had folded him into, staring at the deed, at his mother, at me, the math of his whole plan dissolving in front of him. I should have felt triumphant. Mostly I felt the floor of my family give way. My father broke first, and for one terrible minute I almost felt sorry enough to forget everything. "Then I'm going to lose my house, Mom," he said, and his voice cracked clean down the middle. It came pouring out of him. Then the part he'd never said to her, only to me in fragments on the phone. The defaulted contract, the refinance, then the second one, the bank letters he'd been hiding. He'd been counting on the equity in her house to dig himself out. Had been counting on it so completely that he'd stopped seeing it as hers. He'd already spent it in his head. "I needed it," he said, and there were actual tears, and they were real. I believed everyone, but here's what I noticed. Even through my own ache for him and all of it, he never once said he was sorry. Not to her. He grieved his own house, sitting at the table of the home he'd tried to take, and not once did he say, "Mom, I'm sorry I tried to do this to you." His sorrow was entirely for himself. My grandmother heard all of it, and her face was gentle, and she did not move to save him. "I love you, Roy," she said. "That's why I didn't leave it where you could reach it." That was the closest the night came to mercy. My mother did not break. I watched her do the opposite. I watched her go very still and very cold, the calculation moving behind her eyes like a current under ice. She set the deed down on the table, smoothed it flat with one hand, and when she spoke, her voice had lost every trace of the crack. "A deed," she said quietly, almost to herself, "can be challenged." And the night, which I'd thought was ending, turned over and showed me it had only just begun. I knew what my mother meant before she finished explaining it, because I read these fights for a living. A deed can be challenged, not the recording. You can't argue with a stamp and a date, but the capacity, the state of mind of the person who signed. If you could convince a court that Opel hadn't understood what she was doing 6 years ago, or that someone had unduly influenced her, a vulnerable old woman manipulated by a granddaughter who happened to work in a law office, then maybe a court could be persuaded to set the whole thing aside. My mother laid it out at the table that night, no longer hiding it because hiding was past. She was grieving when she signed that, she said, gesturing at Opel like she wasn't there. Right after Earl died, she wasn't herself. And Serena works for lawyers. It doesn't take much imagination. She was already building the case out loud. They would petition the probate court for guardianship. They'd ask to have Opel declared no longer competent to manage her own affairs and ask the court to appoint them, her son and his wife, as her guardians. And a guardian, they were betting, could move to unwind a 6-year-old deed signed by an incompetent woman. It was breathtaking what they were willing to do. Selling her house had been greed, ordinary and human. This was colder. This was reaching into my grandmother's own mind and trying to declare it forfeit to take not just her home but her standing as a person, her right to have ever decided anything. For the first time all night Opel went quiet. The tea went still in her cup because this was the one move she'd feared, the only one that could reach her, and we both knew it. A piece of paper she could win, but they weren't coming for the paper anymore. They were coming for her. I did not raise my voice. I want you to know that every part of me wanted to throw them out of her house. Wanted to say things I couldn't take back. But I'd watched families lose in court because somebody got loud and somebody else stayed calm, and I knew which one I needed to be. So I stood up and I cleared the teacups, and I said in my work voice that it was time for everyone to go home and that we'd see them in court. My mother smiled at that like she'd rattled me into a threat I couldn't back. She didn't know what I had. After they left, I sat with my grandmother in the quiet kitchen and she finally looked tired, 89 years tired. "I'm sorry, honey," she said. "I thought the deed would be enough. I didn't think they'd come at my mind." I took her hand. "It is enough," I told her, "because you already gave me the answer to this exact question months ago. You just didn't tell me that's what it was." She looked at me, not understanding yet. So I reminded her the cognitive screening she'd asked Dr. Voss to write up and date. The copy she'd tucked into my bag with her own fingers. They wanted to prove she hadn't known her own mind. And I had a signed, dated doctor's record of her mind being clear as a bell on her own request made for exactly this. And I had something better than that. Something I'd find the next morning because Howard Pewitt, the lawyer who drew up that deed 6 years ago, would have a file too. A good elder law attorney always does. I kissed my grandmother goodnight, turned off the kettle, and left the porch light on. I had a record to build. They filed for emergency guardianship within the week. I'll give my mother this, she was fast. The probate court set the matter for a hearing, and as the law requires, sent out a court investigator to interview Opel in her home before anything was decided. That part frightened me more than the courtroom. A stranger with a clipboard arriving to judge whether my grandmother still counted as a competent adult in the very house they were fighting over. I offered to be there. Opel told me no. "If I need you in the room to seem capable," she said, "then I'm not, am I? Go to work, I'll make the man some tea." So I went to work and chewed my pen to splinters all afternoon. The investigator came at 2. He stayed an hour and a half. I got the story later from Opel and much later from his report. She had answered every question. She knew the date, the value of her house within $10,000, the name of the president, and the name of her own lawyer. She explained the life estate to him herself, accurately, better than my father could have. She told him plainly that she deeded the remainder to me 6 years ago because she trusted me and didn't trust the others not to do exactly what they were now doing. And then the investigator wrote, Mrs. Holt offered the undersigned a cup of tea and asked with some humor whether I'd be writing down that an incompetent woman had just out-argued her own son. He noted that she was alert, oriented, and entirely capable, but a report is not a ruling. The hearing still stood. My parents still had a lawyer and a theory, and theories dressed up right have undone steadier truths than ours. So I built the record the way I'd built records for strangers for 8 years, except this one was mine. I drove 2 towns over to Howard Pewitt's office, an old storefront firm with good light and a secretary who'd been there 40 years. Pewitt remembered Opel the moment I said her name. Sharpest woman who ever sat in that chair, he said. He pulled the file himself. Inside was everything a careful lawyer keeps. His contemporaneous notes from the day Opel signed, recording that he'd met with her alone, that he'd confirmed she understood the deed, the life estate, the remainder, and the fact that she could not later undo it without my agreement. There was his signed attestation of her capacity, dated the same day as the deed, 6 years back. Lawyers who do this work write document capacity precisely because someday someone shows up claiming there wasn't any. Pewitt had done it right. I laid it all out on my own kitchen table that night, side by side, the recorded deed public stamped undeniable, Pewitt's capacity attestation from the day of signing, Dr. Voss's recent cognitive screening, the long one dated and clean, the investigator's report calling her alert and capable, the property tax records showing the life estate had been honored by the county for 6 straight years. Every single document my parents would need to be afraid of, my grandmother had already made sure existed, years before they ever reached for her house. She hadn't left me a treasure to stumble onto. She'd left me an argument fully assembled, needing only someone willing to carry it into a courtroom. I was willing. I made a fresh pot of tea at midnight the way she taught me, and I read it all one more time. We were ready. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in a small wood-paneled courtroom that smelled of floor wax and old paper. It wasn't a jury, just a probate judge. The 2 lawyers, the court investigator, my grandmother, and in the gallery, a scatter of relatives who'd heard there was a fight and come to watch a family come apart. Opel wore her good blue dress and sat straight in the chair. My parents' attorney went first. He was smooth. He talked about a grieving widow, vulnerable in her loss, and a granddaughter who worked in a law office and had access and motive. He never quite said I'd manipulated her. He just left the shape of it hanging in the air for the judge to fill in. Then my mother took the stand and she did the thing they'd planned. She isn't capable, my mother said, her voice trembling with what looked from a distance like concern. She hasn't been for years. She gets confused. She forgets. Someone in her condition can't have understood a legal document. She was good. If you didn't know my grandmother, you might have believed her, but our side didn't argue. Our side just opened the folder. Howard Pewitt, who'd agreed to come testify though he was long retired, took the stand and produced his file. He read his own capacity at a station from the day of signing into the record in his dry, careful lawyer's voice. He described meeting Opel alone 6 years ago, confirming she understood every word. Then Dr. Voss's recent screening went in. The long cognitive test, dated and signed, every answer perfect. Then the investigator's report, alert and oriented and entirely capable. The judge listened to all of it with no expression, the way good judges do. And then he did something I didn't expect. He turned to my grandmother directly and asked her in her own words to tell him what she'd done 6 years ago and why. He wanted to hear her, and my grandmother, 89 years old, folded her hands on the rail and began to speak. She didn't ramble, she didn't plead. She spoke in short, clean sentences, one after another, the way she poured tea. My husband died in the spring. I was 83. I went to Mr. Pewitt because I'd watched money turn good families ugly and I didn't want mine to be next. I deeded my house and kept the right to live in it until I die. I gave the rest to my granddaughter Serena because she's the only one who ever came to see me and not the square footage. I knew exactly what I was doing. I have known every day since. She looked at the judge. I'm not confused, Your Honor. I'm just old. People mistake the two on purpose when it's convenient. The courtroom was completely silent. The judge looked down at the stack of documents. The attestation, the screening, the investigator's report, all of it pointing the same direction. And he asked my parents' attorney whether he had any evidence of incapacity beyond his client's testimony. The attorney did not because there wasn't any. That's when my mother lost the calm she'd worn so carefully. It happened in the hallway after, but it happened in front of everyone. The relatives, the clerk, the lawyers filing out. After everything I did for that woman, she said, her voice climbing toward a shriek. I gave that woman years of my life, her errands, her appointments, her weekends. And this is what I get. People turned. My mother had finally raised her voice in a building full of witnesses, and it made her smaller, not larger. I stood very still in the middle of it and didn't raise mine at all. You drove her to appointments, I said quietly enough that people leaned in to hear it. She drove herself to a lawyer. My mother had no answer for that. Behind us, the judge's ruling was already entered. The petition for guardianship was denied. The deed and the life estate stood. My grandmother's mind was her own. Bring me the blue folder, she'd said. She had kept herself all along. In the gallery after, my father did the same thing he'd done at the kitchen table. He sat down. He found a bench at the back of that emptying courtroom and lowered himself onto it like a man whose strings had been cut. And he put his face in his hands. Nobody had asked him to sit. His body just did it twice now, the same surrender in the same week. Derek had already slipped out a side door before the ruling was even read. The way he always left right before a bill came due. My mother stood in the hallway with no one left to perform for, gathered her coat with sharp little movements, and walked out to the parking lot alone. My grandmother, meanwhile, stood up from her chair without help, smoothed her good blue dress, and took my arm, not because she needed to lean on me, but because that's what you do with someone you love when the hard part is finally over. Well, she said as we came down the courthouse steps into the sun, that's enough excitement for an old woman. I asked if she'd been afraid up there with her own son's lawyer calling her confused. She thought about it a little, she admitted. But I'd written the truth down years ago for exactly this day, so all I had to do today was read it back. She patted my hand. Now let's go home and have our tea. The for sale sign came out of Earl's grass the following Monday. Cindy, the realtor, pulled the listing without a word. There was nothing to sell, there never had been, and I think she'd suspected it for a while. My father did lose his house, but not to my grandmother and not to me. He lost it to the bank he'd been hiding from, to the second refinance and the defaulted contract, and a decade of decisions that had nothing to do with Wexler Road. He and my mother moved into a rental apartment across the county. I heard about it secondhand. We don't talk much now. I won't pretend that doesn't ache some nights because it does. You can know you did right and still grieve the family you had before you had to. Derek lost the truck. The promised cut never came because there was never anything to cut, and he drifted off to whatever low spot came next. My mother never apologized, and I've stopped waiting for it. Apologies are for people who think they were wrong. And she still believes, I'm sure, that she was being practical, that I was the one who made it ugly. I've made my peace with being the one she blames. Here is what I kept. I kept my grandmother. Opel still lives at the end of Wexler Road in the house Earl built a quarter-inch out of true, and she will live there until her last day because the law she arranged 6 years ago says so, and because no one can reach it now. I'm her remainder man. The house comes to me after, but neither of us is in any hurry about that. I come by every week same as always, and the porch light is always on before I reach the steps. We sit, she pours. The spoon makes that small, clean sound against the china, and it doesn't mean anything dramatic anymore. It just means tea and a Tuesday. And a woman who kept her own mind in a folder until the day the world tried to tell her she'd lost it. The blue folder is back in the cabinet under the window. The corners are still soft from handling. I have the brass key on my ring where she told me to keep it, and I touch it sometimes without meaning to. A small warm wait, and I remember that the quietest person at the table is very often the one who saw the whole game first. My grandmother never raised her voice once through any of it. She just made sure that on the day she'd need the truth was already written down, dated, and waiting for someone to carry it into the light. That's my story. A teacup, a porch light, and one blue folder she filled 6 years before anyone tried to take her home. If this reminded you to ask the people you love what they actually want before someone else decides it for them, take that as your sign and do it this week. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.